Thanks for joining me. I'm Corel Painter Master Aaron Rutten, and in this video, I'll give you a quick tour of my Corel Painter 2019 custom workspace. In part 1 of this video, I show you how to download and install this workspace, so if you're not at that point yet, make sure to go back and watch that video. You can download this workspace at aaronrutten.com. Now before I dive into the workspace, I do want to mention that the appearance of this workspace may change a little bit because I'm adding new content every month. So depending on when you're watching this video, things might look a little bit different. But for the most part, the workspace isn't going to change that much. So what is a custom workspace? A custom workspace is just the way that I like to arrange things. It's the tools that I use regularly. It's not the tools that I don't use at all. So anything that I don't use is hidden. Anything that I do use is very accessible. I use my brushes a lot. Those are here. Here's some shortcuts that I use a lot. Here's some palettes that I use sometimes, but not all that often. So they're kind of tucked away up here for whenever I need them. You could think of them as drawers, and that's why they're called palette drawers. I can just double click to open and close them like this. Here's my color picker here, which I can move around and I can put on top of artwork so I can compare colors. I have a button here that I can use to toggle between my main and my additional color. I also have a palette for color and layers here, so this has some color set libraries of common colors. Some of these palettes may need to be expanded like this by dragging these 3 dots on the bottom. In particular, these brushes here, when you double click on the tab to open up the palette, you'll have to hover right here in the very center, and you may accidentally click on a brush, that's okay. But you want to click right there in the center and drag down when you get that double-headed arrow, and that'll expand the palette and make it larger. You may have to do that with a lot of these. If you find you're running out of screen space and you can't see all the palettes, just double click to hide some of the other palettes. You can also double click to hide the papers if you're not using that. That gives you more room to see the palettes. Also, if you decide that you want to maybe move some of these off, you can drag from the tab here and remove them, and you could put them anywhere you want. If you want to move it back, you can move it back in here and dock it like this. And if you end up messing everything up and you lose a bunch of palettes and it's all out of order, you can always go back to the window menu, and you can go to Layout, and you can choose large monitor or small monitor depending on the size of your monitor. If you want to just play it safe, choose small monitor. That'll condense everything down into the center or up in the top left, and then that way you'll be able to move it wherever you want it. Now, in addition to making it easier for me to use the workspace, another goal for my workspace is to make it easier for you to follow along with me. So that's why I try not to change the workspace too much. I try to keep things in familiar locations. That way you'll be able to find them when you're following along with the tutorial from several years ago or from one that I create recently. Now you'll still have access to all of the default Corel Painter content as well. If you go up here to the brush selector, you still have all of the brushes available that come installed with Corel Painter. And then you also have all the libraries. But you will notice if you go down here to the bottom, there are a lot of custom categories. These custom brush categories relate directly to these palettes that you see here. These palettes are box files. And if you go to the window menu, and you go to Custom Palette, Organizer, then you can see all of those palettes here. If you click within this window and you use the up and down arrow keys, then you can toggle through that list and see more of the options. There's a slider bar that's missing here. And you can also show and hide those palettes within that same custom palette menu. They're all showing right now, but I could uncheck this to hide them, or I could click on the X to hide it as well. So there's kind of a lot going on here, and it would take a long time to explain how to use all of this stuff. If you want to learn how to use this workspace, the best way to do that is to take some of my courses, namely my Corel Painter 2019 training course, or I have a ton of tutorials on YouTube that you can watch for free. That'll get into a lot of practical ways that you could use the workspace. But in the meantime, what I'll do is I'll just give you a quick tour of how I would use the workspace. So for example, if I'm just starting from scratch, I would go to the shortcuts here and I'd click on New. Now this is faster than having to go up here and click on File once and then twice on New. That's 2 clicks. I can just do 1 here for New. In my custom workspace, I also have some convenient canvas presets. So rather than the Corel Painter defaults, I have specific sizes, and these are based on common print sizes. If you wanted an 8x10 print, there you go. If you wanted something that fits a particular screen or monitor size, I have these options for HD, QHD, and UHD. So I'm going to go ahead and choose 8x10. Now the other number here represents resolution. If you want to learn more about image resolution, you can check out my video on that topic. Let's just go ahead and click on OK to create an 8x10 canvas. So now I can easily access my toolbar to zoom out to get my canvas right where I want it. I can hold spacebar to pan. I can select a brush here. Maybe we're going to make a nice blue sky. So I'll go ahead and just paint in a sky here using my airbrush. Maybe I want to make a cloud, so I'm going to look in oily here. Drag these dots down, and we'll get oily fractal. I'll select a white color. Maybe I want to create a new layer here in my layers palette, so I'll do that. And I'll go ahead and just put in some nice cloudy shapes like this. Maybe I want to use Symmetry Painting. I can turn that on here. And if I wanted to create another new layer, select a different brush, maybe the smooth scratch board. And then I could have something like a butterfly here. And if I'm ready to turn off mirror painting, I can do that. I can move this layer around wherever I want it. If I wanted to free transform it, I have a button for that here, so I can easily free transform it to make it smaller. If I want to see a smaller version of my artwork, I can open the Navigator. And then if I zoom in really closely here, and I start to add details, then I'm able to see my image closely, but then I'm also able to see the composition as a whole from far away. That's very helpful. If I want very specific values, I can choose those here from the color set libraries. I also have the Underpainting Panel, which will let me make adjustments to the layer. I could adjust the brightness or the hue. This is faster than having to go to the effects menu and apply the effect that way. There's also the Stroke Attributes panel. There is color variability and color expression, which I can use to change the colors of my brush strokes. I'll go ahead and hide the Navigator for a second here. Now earlier I mentioned that you can move the temporal color picker around. You could place it on top of your artwork. That'll help you compare colors so you can see this lighter yellow against the base yellow underneath to help make a better judgment about the color that you're picking. If you want that to be bigger, you can drag it from the edge here to make it bigger or smaller, and then just drag it here to put it back. We have the layers palette down here, which we were using. Next to that, we have the layout grid, which will give us a grid that we can put over everything, as you can see here. Next to that is Divine Proportion. You can also enable Divine Proportion. We're not going to go into detail about what that can do. And then if we drag these bottom dots up a bit so we can see more of these layer shortcuts, then we have some layer shortcuts. And similar to the shortcuts up here, we can perform lots of handy commands, but these commands relate specifically to layers. So for example, I could select layer content to put a selection around that layer. I could show and hide that selection while keeping it active. I could deselect the selection by choosing Select None. I can group layers, I can duplicate layers, I can merge and drop layers. I have lots of different options here, and all of this stuff is very conveniently placed here rather than having to try to figure out where it's located in a specific menu, such as grouping layers. You'll also notice that up here in the top right is a list of the recent brushes, so it'll show you a list of the recent brushes that you selected. You can also get to that in your brush selector as well. Now, depending on which layout you choose here in the window menu, could be large monitor or small monitor, the position of this palette could be different. It might actually be over here instead of on the right. And we also have our papers, and we can use that to select a paper texture. So when we're using something like chalk, we can choose a different paper here. Let's try Pebbleboard. Pick a nice green color here. And I can paint in something that looks kind of like leaves. I can increase the scale of that paper and the contrast to make the leaves more noticeable. Or I could select the random chalk brush, which is going to add even more randomization to that chalk. This is using grain. So I have my grain palette here, which is right next to papers in case I ever need to use it. That way I can turn on and off random grain rotation if I like, or I can control the amount of grain. Beneath that we have flow maps, and flow maps are very similar to papers. For example, we can use Dab Chalk Eraser, and that's using a flow map which is set to the dab stencil. So if we want to work with dab stencils, we'll need to open this palette drawer here. You can see it's linked to flow map. And then if I want, I can erase using this texture here that's selected for the flow map. Now I know I'm kind of blazing through a lot of these features here, but again, that's because I have lots of courses and tutorials that explain this stuff in more detail. So if I wanted to work with dab stencils, that's why I have this panel here. If I wanted to work with glazing, there's also an option for that there. If I want to work with texture brushes, those are lumped in here. If I want to work specifically with image hose nozzles or particle brushes, those are accessible here. That's because these are kind of specialty brushes that I don't use all the time. Image hose nozzles are really cool. I could select this clouds nozzle here, select linear size P for my brush, and I could put in some clouds. If I wanted to put in some trees, I could select foliage large, and I can put in trees like this. There are a ton of different nozzles that I created here. These are all custom brushes that I created that are not available in Corel Painter or anywhere else. If you wanted textures, like these cracked textures, you could put in stuff like that. These are very cool brushes. There are also a lot of really awesome particle brushes. For example, here's bushes. This is a particle brush that can create some really interesting organic bush effects. This palm leaf brush, you can use that to create palm leaves. And then there's the brush looks and mixer palette. We'll go ahead and just clear out some of this junk here. We can select a brush look. And if I want a mark that looks like it's a palette knife on canvas, I can get that look. If I use very light pressure, then you can see a lot of that canvas texture there. If I use heavier pressure, then I cover it with thicker paint. If I want a different look, but using the same brush, I can choose knife break. Now if I use lighter pressure, I get that nice broken paint effect. If I use heavier pressure, then I get thicker paint. Or if I want a more rocky look, I can choose a knife rocky. Now I get a rocky texture, and I can refine that texture by adjusting the paper to make the paper bigger or smaller, and then I get a bigger or smaller texture in the paint break here. I could choose this one called Knife Fractal. Now I get a nice fractal effect like this. If I use the mixer, I can add multiple colors here by choosing Sample Multiple Colors. And now if I paint, I can get that mixture of the two colors. So that's why it's handy to have all this stuff lumped together here, because it works together. So there you go. That's kind of a whirlwind tour of what my workspace is and what it can do. Again, if you want to really learn how to use this workspace, check out some of my free YouTube tutorials or my courses that are available at aaronrutten.com. Thanks for watching and enjoy the workspace.